On that particular day, 18 years ago, as we approached the grassy area between the hospital and the parking deck, an overwhelming surge of emotions erupted from within me. Tears flowed uncontrollably, resembling a vast sea of pent-up feelings. It lasted for several minutes, accompanied by a struggle to breathe, somber sounds, intense emotional anguish, and a sense of helplessness. My father, standing nearby, remained composed, dignified, and calm as always. However, I could sense that an emotional storm had also been unleashed within him. He stood by, allowing me to release the initial waves of despair, enabling us to embark on a quiet journey back home. I appreciated the silence during the ride as it provided an opportunity to reflect on that day and contemplate how it would shape our lives moving forward. We spent hours sitting in the hospital waiting room while my mother underwent surgery to remove a tumor near her liver. It was a significant milestone in a series of events that started with elevated liver enzymes following a routine physical examination, leading us to this moment. In the afternoon, her exhausted surgeon finally emerged in the waiting room to meet us. He shared both good and bad news with us, stating simply, "The good news is that she survived the surgery and will be admitted to the ICU this evening." Unfortunately, we were unable to remove the tumor without jeopardizing the portal vein, which could have resulted in her passing away on the operating table. Naturally, we comprehended the implications of his words. She was left with a ticking time bomb within her, destined to eventually claim her life and tear us apart. The next challenge involved informing this woman who had been married to my father for nearly 50 out of her 74 years and had been his lifelong companion. However, my story is not about sharing hers. We did tell her, and she processed the information on her own. Upon learning about her slim chances of survival with chemotherapy, she flatly declined the option. She saw no reason to subject herself to torment unless there was a fighting chance for a positive outcome. With regular replacement of her stent through the bile duct, she was able to accompany my father on various travels for a year, enjoying a new Lincoln Town car that she humorously claimed she had to get sick to acquire. However, things began to take a turn for the worse when the demon within her received a name, cholangiocarcinoma, a rare form of cancer affecting the bile ducts. We witnessed a shift in perspective when my mother accepted her fate. She didn't ask, "Why me?" but rather, "Why not me?" Was she any different from other victims in the world who faced a similar destiny? Life is an unpredictable journey, comprising both joyous moments and hardships. Each of us embarks on a unique path, just like snowflakes. No two journeys are alike. As this merciless disease tightened its grip on her body, my mother and I found laughter once again. During those nighttime trips to the bathroom, we would share moments of laughter when she would pass gas or do something ordinary, as if it were absurd. I'm not sure if my father ever truly understood, but when I returned to her room, laughing together, her sense of humor radiated and infected me. For the longest time, she had appeared perfectly healthy as the stent fulfilled its role, allowing bile to flow through her liver. We made frequent visits to the hospital, whether for stent replacement or to address other cancer-related concerns. As time passed, one particular incident stood out among the rest. It was when our hospice nurse came to see her that afternoon. She vomited bile, a sight I had never witnessed before. I felt grateful for the presence of the hospice nurse during that moment. I followed an ambulance to the hospital after it was called, arriving before it did. I joined her doctor in the emergency room, where he informed me that she was likely nearing the end of her life. When a staff member asked me what was wrong with my mother, I approached the check-in area and provided the necessary information. Tears streamed down my face as I processed the question, and with that, my mother stood up and guided me to a separate room where I could be alone. I called one of my closest friends to inform her of the situation. Shortly after ending the call, a nurse appeared with a cold, refreshing ginger ale, a magical elixir that always seemed to be plentiful in hospitals. I sat, consumed the drink, and pondered for quite some time. When my friend appeared at the doorway, I was overwhelmed with joy. However, I was completely unprepared for what I would witness when I finally saw my mother. As I pulled back the curtain to the alcove where she was waiting to be moved to a room, I saw her staring upwards with wide-open eyes, but it seemed as if she couldn't see anything. Later, a doctor informed me that she had experienced a brainstem stroke, a condition from which recovery was not possible. That night, and every subsequent night, she remained silent. I stayed by her side in the room, whether on a cot or a large chair, praying, sleeping, conversing with my father during his visits, and, of course, advocating for her, as one must when a loved one is hospitalized. Meanwhile, my brother made preparations to fly out from Montana. During my time in that room, I did not pray for complete healing. Instead, I held on to hope that my mother would regain her strength so that she could bid her final farewell to my brother. I incessantly prayed for him and for her. Finally, the day of his arrival came. My father went to the airport to meet him while I waited for their return. Our minister arrived, and we engaged in conversation in the hallway outside my mother's room. As the elevator doors opened, my father and brother emerged. We waited anxiously as they entered her room. Then, my father appeared at the door and beckoned me inside, saying, "I think you better come in, Ralph." Our minister and I entered, only to find my mother alert and engaged in conversation with her son, wearing a broad smile on her face. My simple request had been granted. She had fought hard to make this final meeting with her son possible. Truly, God works in mysterious ways, and my prayer had been answered. I was numb. My mother had entered her last weeks of life, and she did not wish to pass away in a hospital. Thus, we brought her home, arranging a hospital bed for her. The compassionate hospice workers set up the bed in the den and taught me how to administer medication through her intravenous line. Despite my initial fear, which stemmed from watching television dramas involving complications from injections, such as air in the veins, I realized that, as my mother put it, since she was my mother, such mishaps would never occur. She had trained me well, and I learned that what transpires on television is not always a reflection of reality. My brother and mother shared a beautiful visit, conversing for hours on end. It seemed that God did not consider the brain stem stroke to be an obstacle. However, her condition deteriorated rapidly once my brother departed, and the hospice nurse had to address issues such as impaction and a series of other challenges as the cancer within her waged its final battle. There were occasions when we had to seek assistance from a nurse. I had taken leave under the Family Leave Act to be there for her full time. As a person gradually approaches death, it seems as though they exist in a state caught between two worlds. My mother began experiencing this. The nurses who cared for her took notes to ensure that I would not miss any unusual occurrences. On occasion, one of the nurses would get goosebumps. I was on the floor above the den when I heard my mother call out the name Earl, the name of her deceased brother. It appeared as though she had spotted him and was trying to get his attention. She repeatedly called out his name during these goosebump-inducing moments. The room felt filled with an overwhelming spiritual presence. Mom invited me to join her in the ethereal light. At that point, I left the room, preoccupied with the impending loss. Later, the nurse informed me that my mother had told her that she was reluctant to leave because my father and I would be devastated. When I returned to the room, my mother looked up at me and said, "No, she won't be able to come with me," as if she had received some sort of message. She also appeared to communicate with her late sister. My mother mentioned that her sister was nearby and invited her to pick blackberries together, just like they did in their childhood. She expressed her readiness to leave and mentioned that someone named Peggy was coming, although I never figured out who Peggy was. My mother said she was ready to accompany them, believing that everything would be fine. However, she expressed concern about my father and me. I reassured her that we would be fine and that I would take care of my father. On that day, my mother announced that she would be departing. She remarked that nature surrounded her and that she wished to return home. She mentioned that her sister and a man were waiting for her in the light but that she was afraid to go. She said that everything would be fine soon and that she was leaving. She expressed her readiness to be with them. As she drifted away, the last thing she uttered was "Mother." Silence woke me up around 2 a.m. I knew she had passed away. I checked and was upset to see her eyes wide open. I immediately called the hospice nurse. During my mother's illness, my father had suffered a minor stroke. I wanted the nurse to be present when I informed him. She arrived promptly and took charge. It was all God's doing. My mother and I had found peace. It wasn't until later that I recalled my mother sharing a story with me about her mother's death. Family members had gathered at her bedside when she was in a coma for an extended period. Suddenly, she woke up and announced that she had made peace with God and that her brother Oscar was waiting for her. She declared that she would accompany him, and at that moment, she passed away. I realized that, unknowingly, I had witnessed something profound in the process of dying, and being part of it had been a blessing. In this unpredictable journey of life, we learn that although sadness and loss can overwhelm us, there are also miracles, courage, and peace to be found in the final moments. Through this story, we are reminded to cherish every moment and realize that behind the veil of death, there are miracles that connect us to another world. Thank you for listening to my story.